Testing, testing. Can people hear me? Can people hear me? I'm hoping I'm audible. How does it sound? 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 Okay, yeah, we'll just get started in a couple minutes. I'm just going to wait for a few people to join in if they're interested in joining in. Looks like it's going to be a nice day today. Nice blue sky, at least in Calgary. I don't know where people are tuning in from, but in Calgary, the weather looks like it's going to be nice today. Blue sky, not too much wind, nice calm day it looks like. I'm going to test something. I want to see if I can wait for a few people to join in if they're interested in joining in. Can people hear me okay? Okay. So it's 2 after 10. So why don't we get started? Um, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Russ Weninger. I'm a lawyer with the Weninger Jong Law Firm, and I've been doing a weekly webinar series over the last little more than a month on COVID-19 and immigration. So I'm trying to talk about things that might be of interest to people who uh, they don't yet have permanent residence and they're currently in Canada and they want to preserve their temporary status. Maybe they want to acquire permanent resident status. So I've been doing this every Wednesday for the last month and a bit, 10 o'clock on Wednesday mornings. And so today I'm going to, it's not really structured. I'm just going to give a bit of some updates about what's been happening over the last little while. Some I don't know, rumors, I guess you could say, some speculation about what might happen down the road in terms of immigration law and policy. So that's going to be the focus today, and I'm also going to take viewer questions. So if anyone at any point has any questions at all, please put those questions in the live chat box, and I will answer as many of those questions as I possibly can. My one caveat, though, would be to make sure that you don't reveal too much personal information about yourself. This is YouTube. This is, public. This is for the whole world to see. Not that the whole world will see my little YouTube channel, but in theory, that's possible. That people from all over the world could be. And in fact, I do get inquiries from all over the world from people who have watched my YouTube channel. So I would strongly encourage you not to list too much identifying information about yourself if you're going to ask any type of question, because uh, yeah, you never know who's going to be watching this live stream. I should also mention I'll be posting an archive version of this live stream on my YouTube channel as well. So if you have to duck out, if you miss part of it, if you show up late, there will still be the opportunity to go back later on and watch the webinar if you miss something, or if you forgot what I said and you want to go over it again. It will be on YouTube. But for that reason, because it is going to be, for the long haul, going to be up on YouTube, uh, yeah, don't put anything too personal if you have any questions. Okay, well, yeah, we've got 4 people tuned in so far. I'm not sure if that's counting me or not, but that's good. That's showing that some people are getting some benefit from this. I oftentimes find, actually, when I do these YouTube live stream webinars, is that other people will tune in later to watch. So I'll get a certain number of views uh, from the initial live stream, and then within about 24 hours to 48 hours, those views will be doubled or tripled. So that means people are actually tuning in, but they're maybe not tuning in right during the live stream. But the advantage of watching the live stream is that you get to ask questions. So if you have any questions, um, and those questions don't have to be about your situation, they could be about a friend's situation, it could be a more theoretical question. Ideally, I'd like to keep it to immigration law related topics. So if you have any questions about Canadian immigration law, I'm happy to address those, but I don't want to be taking questions about landlord-tenant law or about criminal law or about things that I don't really deal with on a day-to-day basis. My focus in my practice, I practice in a couple of areas actually. I practice in wills on estates, but I also practice in the area of, or my primary practice area, I should say, is Canadian immigration law. Um, well, I shouldn't say my primary practice. It's close to 50-50 wills and estates and immigration, but and I also do the odd litigation file. Um, uh, sometimes I'll delve into other areas of law, but for the most part, I focus on immigration and wills and estates. And in terms of immigration, I focus on Canadian immigration. So sometimes people call me up. They ask me if I do American immigration work, or if I can help them apply for a visa to Thailand, or if I can, help them apply for a visa to Australia or something like that. No, I'm not licensed to practice law in any of those jurisdictions. I'm only licensed to practice law in Canada. I should also note, I don't really give any advice on um, uh, immigration to Quebec. Uh, Quebec requires Quebec immigration kind of requires specialized knowledge that should be offered by a lawyer from Quebec. So I don't advise clients on any Quebec immigration applications. My advice to a client wanting to immigrate to Quebec would be to have a chat with a Quebec immigration lawyer. But yeah, in most areas of Canadian immigration law, I practice. Um, some areas more than others, but I'm a bit of a jack of all trades when it comes to Canadian immigration law. I do everything from refugee claims to spousal sponsorships. I do some work permit applications. I do some study permit applications. I do express entry. I've done the odd judicial review application. So yeah, I practice in in a number of different areas related to Canadian immigration law. I should tell you a little bit about kind of my personal background as well. So I think it was maybe last week or the week before I mentioned I grew up in Pincher Creek, Alberta, and I did my my first bit of university education at the University of Lethbridge. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. I spent a year up in Edmonton at the University of Alberta when I was 18 years old. So just out of high school, I spent a year up in Edmonton, and I got a little bit homesick actually, and so I wanted to be closer to my family in Pincher Creek, and so I transferred to the University of Lethbridge, and to the University of Lethbridge, and I completed my degree at the University of Lethbridge. It was a Bachelor of Arts degree, and it was a double major in music and philosophy. And oftentimes people like me who do degrees in things like music or philosophy, or in my case music and philosophy, um, they have trouble finding work afterwards, and because those degree programs uh, tend to be for students who are doing it out of a kind of a personal interest, but they're not necessarily uh, degree programs that are geared towards vocations. I should actually, yeah, philosophy isn't that way, for sure. But music, uh, there is a vocational aspect to that for sure. Most people doing music degrees want to be performing musicians or teach music, but the unfortunate fact of the matter is that it's tough to make a living as a musician. And so
When I was in law school, oftentimes other people in my classes were people who had completed various arts degrees or fine arts degrees. They were passionate about something like music. I had one friend who in law school who did a degree in medieval music. Maybe even I think she did a master's in medieval music. But she, yeah, ultimately went to law school. Um, so yeah, among the lawyers out there in Canada, many of them have these interesting and varied backgrounds. Some lawyers even come from scientific or engineering fields. I had some friends in law school who were chemists, engineers, people like that, and then they decided they wanted to give law a try. So so yeah, I did my undergrad degree at the University of Lethbridge in with a combined major in music and philosophy, and I absolutely loved Lethbridge. And then I went to Dalhousie University to do a master's degree in philosophy, and I ended up after that wanting to stay in Halifax, and I wasn't really sure what I was going to do though. But I wanted to still wanted to be a university student, still wanted to stay in Halifax. So I did some computer science courses, and and then I eventually applied to law school, and I got accepted to Dalhousie Law School. So I completed my degree there, and then ended up moving back to Alberta. I wanted to be closer to my family, so I moved back. Um, this was in the mid 2000s, and then got a job at a law firm up in Edmonton to article, and and then I, after articling, moved down to Calgary, and I started my own practice, and then just last year, so in the fall of 2019, I joined up with another lawyer, Kathy Jong, and we formed the Weninger Jong Law Firm. And I should tell you a little bit about Kathy because Kathy has a very interesting background. Kathy's a real immigrant success story. So Kathy, she was a lawyer in China, actually, and in fact, she wasn't just a lawyer; she was actually a judge in China. She graduated top of her class from one of the top law schools in China. After law school, she worked as a judge, and then she ended up doing a master's degree at the University of Hong Kong, which is a very prestigious. It's one of the top universities in the world, basically. So she did a master's degree in common law. For those of you who don't know, there's a bit of a distinction between legal systems. Uh, Many legal systems around the world, including the legal system in China, they use a legal system based historically on Roman law. So it's called a civil law system. So that's probably the most common legal system in the world. But the other common legal system is the common law legal system. So the system that derives from English law historically. And so in Canada, in the US, and the UK, in India, in basically any country, Australia, New Zealand, any country that used to be a part of the British Empire. Those countries use common law or tend to use common law legal systems, and that's the way it is in Canada. Actually, Canada is a mixed system because we in Quebec, Quebec actually uses a civil law system for most of its law. So Quebec's a little bit of an anomaly, but the rest of Canada uses a common law system of law. So back to Kathy. So she did this degree in common law, a master's degree in common law from the University of Hong Kong, because Hong Kong also it was formerly part of the British Empire, and so they have a common law legal system as well. So China's kind of, if you could call China slash Hong Kong, a country, and I guess they are. Um, uh, certainly a nation or a country in many respects. Uh, uh, but it's kind of the inverse of Canada. So in Canada, we have most of the provinces being common law jurisdictions, and Quebec is the anomaly. It's a civil law jurisdiction. In China, it's the reverse. So in China, most of the country is civil law, but in Hong Kong, it's a common law jurisdiction. So Kathy studied there in Hong Kong and got her master's degree in common law. And then she eventually immigrated to Canada and went to Dalhousie University and did a master's at Dalhousie University, which was where I did law school as well. I didn't know her at the time. We went at different times and studied different things with different people basically. But yeah, we both went to Dalhousie Law School. So yeah, then Kathy, once she graduated from Dalhousie Law School, she moved out to Alberta and to Calgary and articled. And upon completion of her articles, she started her own law firm and was almost super successful overnight. Uh, in Calgary, despite the fact that we've got a number of uh, people from China living in Calgary, and China's one of the top source countries for immigrants to Canada. Uh, so despite the fact that we've got a lot of immigrants from China in Calgary, there are very few Mandarin speaking lawyers here in Calgary, and Kathy is one of them. Um, Kathy really made a name for herself, especially in the Chinese community, as a top quality lawyer. So yeah, if you ever get a chance to, if you have some legal issue that requires a good quality lawyer, I'd highly recommend my colleague Kathy Zhang. Uh, she practices primarily in the areas of business law, so corporate commercial law. She also does residential real estate. She also does litigation and family law. And she does a little bit of immigration law as well. I focus mostly on immigration, and Kathy focuses on a lot of the other things. But there's a good chance you might need a lot of the other things. The average person will at some point in their life purchase a house or sell a house. A lot of people will start businesses, especially immigrants. Oftentimes, immigrants start businesses, and for that, you oftentimes need a good lawyer. So, so Kathy does that work. So, yeah, as I was mentioning, I joined up with Kathy back in 2019, and we formed the Weninger Dong Law Firm. And yeah, things have been going great aside from the pandemic and but a couple months ago, I don't know, personally I was kind of worried that we were into a virtual apocalypse, but a couple of months in, you know yeah, things could be better, but on the whole, I think the government in Canada is doing a good job of managing the pandemic, and life is slowly getting back to normal. The economy hasn't completely cratered, and I'm cautiously optimistic. So I think you know, hopefully it's going to be a new normal for sure. We're going to have to continue to take precautions, but it seems like life is improving, and at the very least, life isn't as bad as it could be during a pandemic. Um, Now, that relates actually to some advice I've given in earlier webinars. So, in some earlier webinars, I wasn't really um, necessarily sure how bad the pandemic would get, and so I considered some best case scenarios, and I considered some worst case scenarios, and um, and the worst case scenarios were that people would be trapped in Canada, that a lot of businesses would be shut down, that people wouldn't be able to get back home, and maybe the situation in people's home countries would be dire. You'd have people dying in large numbers and bodies piling up in the streets and things like that. And so uh, so a couple of things I recommended that people consider. One is a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application. So, if a person wants to qualify for permanent residence and they don't otherwise qualify for permanent residence, um, and they're currently in Canada, one thing they can potentially do is apply for permanent residence based on humanitarian and compassionate considerations. And to do that, what you have to do is satisfy an immigration officer that there are compelling humanitarian reasons for you in particular to be allowed to stay in Canada permanently, even though you don't otherwise meet the requirements for permanent residence. So this was one stream I kind of recommended that people consider humanitarian and compassionate grounds. Now, uh, given kind of the trajectory of the pandemic, given the fact that um, uh, in, not necessarily in all parts of the world, but in some parts of the world, the pandemic maybe hasn't hit that hard. Things maybe aren't as bad as they could have been. And in Canada, we seem to be getting you know uh, control of things. We seem to be flattening the curve on the pandemic. Hospitalization rates tend to be going down in most parts of the country. The death rate seems to be going down. So things could have been more dire, and they turned out to be maybe not as bad, at least in Canada and at least in some other parts of the world. And so the fact that I recommended humanitarian applications to people, um, and I think humanitarian applications might still be viable options for some people who are stuck in Canada right now and who want to apply for permanent residence. But it might not be a universally applicable solution. There, it may be the case that in a couple of months, airlines start doing more routine international flights. It might be the case that the government opens up the borders again and people are allowed to travel back home. And uh, it, it might be the case that uh, who knows, maybe we even get a vaccine or something like that, or some effective treatment for COVID-19. Uh, and if that's the case, a lot of the arguments in support of a humanitarian application will go out the window. And practically speaking, it takes, in many cases, in most cases, probably somewhere between a year and 2 years to process a humanitarian application. So an agency, a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application, uh, it usually takes about a year or so to process the first stage of the application. And then if a person gets an approval in principle, it might take 6 months to a year after that to get permanent residence. I'm not sure of the average processing times recently for humanitarian applications, but I think it's probably somewhere in that 1 year to 2 year range. Um, So and going forward, I think as a rule, due to the fact that right now a lot of immigration officers are working from home, and some backlogs are building up, and things like that. Uh, Processing for most immigration applications will probably take longer than they have in the past, and so a humanitarian application, I think you can expect it to take at least 2 years to be processed to completion. That may not end up being the case, but I suspect that's going to be the case. Uh, so in other words, if you submit an application now, and 6 months from now there's a vaccine and everyone's back to work and people are traveling all over the world, and this pandemic, aside from the fact that there's maybe a lot of government debt and maybe some businesses went under and things like that, but in 6 months, maybe this pandemic is largely just a bad memory. um, so if that's the case, then a humanitarian application under those circumstances might not succeed. Even if at the time you submitted your application, you had a bunch of very strong humanitarian grounds for applying for permanent residence. If in 6 months' time, or a year's time, or a year and a half's time, or something like that, when they're processing your application, they come to the immigration officer comes to the realization that a lot of the initial humanitarian concerns no longer apply. Then that sort of application, there's a good chance it'll be rejected. So I just wanted people to be aware of that I'm not necessarily backtracking on my earlier suggestion that people look at humanitarian applications, because I think they're still worth looking at. But um, one thing is, oftentimes people contact my office, and I had this happen the other day actually, and it kind of ticked me off a little bit. Um, uh, someone contacted me, and there were, we were exchanging a lot of emails back and forth, and they were trying to fish for a lot of free legal advice from me, basically. And so they kept on prodding me, well, how do you do this, and what's the process for this, and finally I just said, look, I'm not doing this for free. You're going to have to, I do provide free content on YouTube and in other places on the internet, but if you want me to spend time dealing with your personal circumstances, you're going to have to pay for that in a consultation. And and then the person responded saying, well, but I first of all need to make sure that you're going to be able uh, to get me the result I want. I need you to provide me with a guarantee. And I told him point blank, this person, I said, there are no guarantees. I can't guarantee that anything we do will necessarily succeed. Um, by the way, if anyone tells you, so if any immigration lawyer gives you an absolute guarantee, or where you see this a lot is in immigration consultants. So immigration consultants, I've seen my colleague Kathy Jong, actually, she's shown me um, advertisements that some immigration consultants circulate in China, and so these advertisements are written in Mandarin Chinese, um, and they basically promise people permanent residence. They say, if you pay us X number of dollars, and X number of dollars is usually something outrageous, like $50,000 or $60,000, or some absurd, obscene sum of money. And now I should mention that in some cases, for some immigration streams, that might be um, uh, you know an appropriate um, immigration fee for applying under or some particular stream, but but for the things these people were applying for, it was way out of line. So a simple work permit, and the person would be spending $50,000, $60,000, something like that. So that's basically fraudulent. That's um, yes, in theory, you know, uh, uh, an immigration lawyer or consultant can charge what, but there's a market rate for certain immigration services, and if you're paying more than, say, a few $1,000s for a routine work permit application, something's probably wrong. Um, so anyways, yeah, Kathy and I would sometime, or Kathy would note sometimes she'd get friends and acquaintances from China sending her these messages about these advertisements in China, promising permanent residence if you paid a certain amount of money. And um, it, and to make it absolutely crystal clear, uh, no one can guarantee you permanent residence. Absolutely no one. Uh, Even if you're an immigration officer, you can't you can't guarantee that someone will get permanent residence, because there are so many steps along the way to acquiring permanent residence, and so many variables, uh, and there are a lot of different decision makers. So when you submit a permanent residence application, for example, you submit an application that gets reviewed by a particular immigration officer, and maybe it's being reviewed by more than one immigration officer. It might be initially reviewed for completeness and then passed on to someone else to do a more thorough review of the application. But the immigration application, eventually, even when a person is given the you know sort of conditional approval for permanent residence, they still have to go and do what's called a landing interview. So they still have to they have one final step where they have to um, uh, meet with an immigration officer who's probably going to be a different immigration officer than the person who reviewed the application, or they have to go and uh, meet with a Canada Border Services officer. That's another way to do the landing interview. So at that stage, the application can get rejected, even if the initially the immigration officer seemed that was processing the application seemed to approve everything. Um, so yeah, my point being is that there are no guarantees. There can't be any guarantees, and anyone who tells you that they're guaranteeing you success in an immigration application, they're probably a con artist. They're probably a scam artist, a charlatan. Uh, they they either don't know what they're talking about, so they're either very inexperienced, or they're they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. They're trying to deceive you. They're trying to take your money, and unfortunately, there's very little recourse. If a lawyer rips you off, you can potentially complain to the law society. You can sue the lawyer. There are certain things you can do. Um, with If an immigration consultant rips you off, if they're a licensed consultant, you can report them to the what's called ICCRC, which is the regulatory body for immigration consultants here in Canada. Unfortunately, ICCRC is very lax in its enforcement of standards. So oftentimes they basically don't do a lot of investigation when people file complaints. So um, you know, it's practically the case that immigration consultants in many respects can get away with murder. Um, they oftentimes steal their clients' money. They oftentimes get very bad results for clients that could have been good results had the consultants been doing their job properly. And there's very little recourse for the client afterwards. So now I'm not saying that all immigration licensed immigration consultants are bad or anything like that, but there are a significant number. There is a significant number of immigration consultants that's not up to par, and maybe even ripping people off. Um, then there are ghost consultants. So those are people who aren't even licensed as licensed immigration consultants, and these are people who are probably not even operating in Canada. They're probably just operating overseas in places like China. Although in some cases they might be operating in Canada. And if those people um, rip you off, if you're in Canada, yeah, maybe you can complain to the RCMP or to uh, Canada Border Services or something, and maybe they'll investigate. But um, uh, but if it's overseas, if it's in a place like China that these people are operating, or in India or Pakistan or the Philippines, or those are oftentimes places where ghost consultants will operate, unlicensed immigration consultants. Uh, so if these people are operating in those sorts of places, there's very little uh, enforcement that the Canadian government can bring to bear in those circumstances. So it's kind of buyer beware to a certain degree if you're dealing with one of those overseas ghost consultants, and I would strongly recommend not doing that. It's basically, if you're using one of those consultants, as far as IRCC is concerned, if they're not licensed, you're actually violating Canadian immigration law. So uh, that in and of itself is a reason for IRCC to reject your application if they find out that you were receiving help from an unlicensed immigration consultant. Um, but that being said, even if the immigration consultant is licensed, um, you should be very skeptical about the advice that you get, and you should, be very reluctant to give large sums of money to such consultants. You know, $2,000 to $3,000 for a work permit application, $3,000 to $5,000 for a permanent residence application. Those sorts of fees are probably reasonable, but if you're talking, $50,000, $60,000 for a work permit application or something like that, that's not reasonable. Um, so so yeah, and that goes back to my earlier comment about guarantees. There in immigration law, there there can't be any outcome guarantees, or at least no professional, uh, no one in my position, for example, would be able to offer such a guarantee. And if a lawyer or consultant or anyone told you they were guaranteeing um, that something would be approved, that right there should be a red flag. Um, Another reason I don't guarantee outcomes is because uh, success in these sorts of applications depends so much on the accuracy of the information that the client is providing to me, and I have no way of knowing whether the client is telling me the truth. So there are some situations where clients may lie about their past to me or give me false documents or things like that. And so if that gets revealed, that the client is going to be banned from Canada for misrepresentation for 5 years. So how can I possibly guarantee that? I simply can't. So um, yeah, if anyone tells you that uh, you can get permanent residence guaranteed just by hiring them, they're full of garbage, and don't believe a word they say. So yeah, I wanted to let people know that I think that maybe the humanitarian application option that I was promoting a little bit earlier. I'm still promoting it. I think it's still a good idea for people to consider in many cases, but uh, the way the pandemic is playing out and the way things are slowly starting to get back to normal, and considering the timelines for humanitarian applications, um, I suspect it's still the case that most of those applications probably won't succeed. Some will. Um, um, you know, I'm not sure what recent stats for success rates on humanitarian applications are, but I remember at least a few years back, I was looking at some stats where humanitarian success rates were in the neighborhood of 25% or something like that. So it's possible that you'll succeed with your humanitarian application, but it's also quite possible that you won't succeed, is my point. The same with temporary resident permit applications. I've been advocating um, their use as well as a possible remedy if you fall out of status, or if you want to apply for permission to work in Canada and you don't have other viable means of applying for a work permit. Then a temporary resident permit application is a possibility. But um, one of the big problems with temporary resident permits, like with humanitarian applications, they take a long time to be processed. So a temporary resident permit application might take more than a year to be processed. And in the meantime, if things have improved in Canada and in other parts of the world, if COVID-19 numbers have gone down, if death rates have gone down, maybe we have a vaccine even. Um, getting approvals for temporary resident permits, TRPs, might be tricky um, for a lot of people. Um, but it's still something to consider if you have no other viable means for applying for example, worker status, or for preserving your status as a visitor in Canada. So a TRP might be the uh, you know a possible remedy. It might be the way to go, but um, don't don't get your hopes up. Don't put all your eggs in that basket, because um, yeah, it may or it may not work. Another similar strategy, it's actually not really similar, but it's a, it's a strategy that I recommended, um, is to look at doing significant benefit work permit applications. So I strongly I felt, well, I had um, this view, and I still hold that view, actually, that anyone working in the economy right now is significantly benefiting the economy. Anyone who's working, uh, paying taxes, paying rent, buying their own groceries. Anyone who's doing that is significantly benefiting the economy. That's my view, and I think that's objectively correct. Um, you know, in in a situation where you have massive unemployment numbers, where you have uh, l- large numbers of people unable to pay rent or buy groceries or things like that. Um, in a situation like that, being able to do those basic things means that you're uh, providing a net benefit to the Canadian economy. And uh, there is a work permit stream for that, and it's called significant benefit work permit. So a significant benefit work permit is just, it's not restricted to economic benefit, but it can be used for that purpose when a person's work in Canada would lead to a significant economic benefit. Um, Now, uh, part of the problem with significant benefit work permit applications is that they're usually reserved for people who are starting businesses in Canada, or for artists or athletes, or scientists of international renown, or people like that. So um, a hotel worker in Banff, would such a person qualify for a significant benefit work permit? Ordinarily not. Ordinarily, that person would not be a good candidate for a significant benefit work permit. Are they a good candidate now? Um, I, well, eh, I would say it's still something that can be tried, and depending on the immigration officer, such a strategy might succeed. But um, I suspect most immigration officers, given kind of the way things are playing out with the pandemic, with things starting to get a little bit back to normal again, with businesses starting to open up again a little bit, with the economy kind of being sustained by government benefits such as the CERB and the wage subsidy and stuff like that. Um, and the rent subsidy, and the commercial rent subsidy, and things like that. So I think, on the whole, uh, uh, it's going to be a tough sell to satisfy an immigration officer that someone who's, for example, in a retail job or something like that, that they should qualify for a significant benefit work permit. Um, Now, that being said, if it's a retail job in something like fast food, or um, in a supermarket, a grocery store, um, uh, those sorts of workers are considered essential workers, and who knows, maybe an immigration officer would consider uh, that to be justifiable, in terms of you know uh, being worthy of a significant benefit work permit. But it's really hard to say. So it's something to maybe try, but don't get your hopes up. Don't think that it's a guarantee of success or anything like that. It's not. Significant benefit work permit applications, temporary resident permit applications, humanitarian and compassionate grounds applications. Uh, those things might be worth trying, but by no means are they. Uh, uh, at the best of times, the likelihood of success for those applications is kind of small, and I suspect even now the likelihood of success for those sorts of applications is kind of small. So in certain circumstances, they may be worth trying, and in fact, I'm recommending those applications uh, to some clients based on their particular circumstances, but uh, those applications may or may not be right for you is the point I'm trying to make. And you have to do a cost benefit analysis, and because every time you submit an application, it's you know even if you're doing it yourself and you're not paying legal fees, you're paying government fees, and there are other costs associated with the application. So you yourself have to do a cost benefit analysis, and if an application maybe stands a 5% chance of succeeding, in some circumstances that might be high enough to justify doing the application, but maybe for you, the money you would spend on that application would be better spent on a plane ticket home or on something else, buying groceries or something. um, so so I wanted to mention that that those sorts of applications that I've been promoting in prior webinars, they're highly discretionary, and so if you're going to do them, I think you should do them as best you can and make the strongest arguments you can. But at the end of the day, don't get your hopes up. Those applications might not succeed. So that's a bit of a downer. So that update, or that bit of food for thought, that's probably not what everyone wants to hear. There's some good news as well. Now, in the past, in one of my webinars, I was asked by some people whether there were any concessions being made for people on study permits, whether the government was going to allow people to study remotely or study online and still qualify for things like a postgraduate work permit. Um, and in the past, I wasn't sure about that, and my gut reaction was no, probably not. The government doesn't usually allow online studies to count towards a degree for the purposes of getting a postgraduate work permit. But um, but recently, I was checking out the government website and noticed a few things. Um, so uh, yeah, one thing the government mentioned was that students who are already studying in Canada and whose classes have been moved online due to travel or health restrictions introduced because of COVID-19, they won't be penalized regarding postgraduate work permit eligibility. Uh, so if you're currently in Canada and you're forced to do online classes that previously would have been in-person classes because of COVID-19, you'll still be able to qualify for, or you should still be able to qualify for a postgraduate work permit, assuming you would have been otherwise eligible to qualify for a postgraduate work permit. Not all students in Canada are eligible for a postgraduate work permit. So it's only certain types of educational programs. It's only certain types of people. For example, you can only have one postgraduate work permit in your life. So if you, yeah, even if you're studying in Canada, you might not meet the requirements for a postgraduate work permit. But but if you otherwise would have met the requirements for a postgraduate work permit, but um, your only obstacle now is that you have to do online courses, uh, that's okay. You can do those online courses and it can still count towards your postgraduate work permit. The same applies to distance learning outside of Canada. So let's say you were scheduled to begin a degree program at the University of Saskatchewan, but you can't travel to Canada because because of COVID-19. You can actually take online courses through the University of Saskatchewan, if assuming those online courses are offered in your program. But you can take those courses, and that can still count uh, towards the program of study in Canada. So you can still, I think you can count up to 50% of the total courses towards, or sorry, you can complete up to 50% of your program of study with these courses, these distance learning courses, at least for the time being. So that's the policy at the moment. If things change, if the borders open up, and if students are allowed back into Canada, and if universities and colleges are starting to resume with their in-person classes, then this policy will likely end. But for the time being, you can take online courses and have it count towards a degree program or a diploma program, for the purposes of having it be considered a Canadian degree or diploma program, and for the purposes of applying for a postgraduate work permit. So that's some good news. Um, so now for some bad news, or some possible bad news. Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, recently announced that the government would be taking steps to prioritize Canadian permanent resident workers in the province of Alberta. So what this suggests a couple of things, a couple of possible things. One thing it suggests is that the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program might see some significant changes in the near future. There might actually be a hold put on the program. It might be the case that the government returns applications that have already been submitted under the program even. Now, I should be clear, this hasn't been announced, at least as far as I'm aware. This hasn't been announced. This is pure speculation on my part, but it's entirely possible that, with Jason Kenney's announcement that the government wants to prioritize Canadians and permanent residents living in Alberta, it's entirely possible that the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program will see some major changes. And it might be the case that applications are paused, put on halt. And maybe applications will even be returned. Maybe the government will just simply say, we're not going to do any processing at the moment under the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program, and we won't do any processing for the foreseeable future. That's possible. They're not saying that at the moment, as far as I'm aware, but that could be what comes out of Jason Kenney's prioritizing permanent residents and Canadian citizens. Another thing the Alberta government could theoretically do is something that the Alberta government did a few years back during the economic recession with the oil and gas industry. So a few years back, what the government did was they actually had an agreement with Service Canada federally that LMIAs, labor market impact assessments, wouldn't be issued for certain occupations in Alberta where was significant unemployment in that sector. So, for example, certain trade occupations, certain technical occupations, engineering occupations, things like that, um, things related to oil and gas, the oil and gas industry. Um, the government actually, the Alberta government, um, entered into an agreement with Service Canada, in which Service Canada wouldn't issue LMIAs for those occupations in Alberta. Now, um, something like that could happen going forward, potentially. So the government might even, um, try to do what New Brunswick was doing for a while, which was to ban temporary foreign workers from entering the province. Um, I don't think it's going to go that far, but you know, in theory, the government could try something like that, where they try to the Alberta government tries to prevent or maybe through cooperation with the federal government, um, uh, seeks to prevent people from qualifying for work permits to work in the province of Alberta. Again, that's pure speculation. I don't know if that's going to happen, but based on Jason Kenney's recent statements about prioritizing Canadians and permanent residents, I think it wouldn't overly surprise me if there are some um, unfortunate consequences for people who are here temporarily in Canada, or for people who want to come uh, to Alberta temporarily. Um, so so that's something to keep in mind. I have some clients who are chomping at the bit to submit AINP applications, and a few of these clients email me on a regular basis, and they ask me, Russ, is AINP still happening? Are they still processing applications? Are they still accepting applications? All I can tell them is, uh, for the time being, yes, but going forward, who knows? Um, so that's something to keep in mind, that uh, Alberta Immigrant Nominee, the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program, that that may possibly be halted in the not too distant future. So my recommendation would probably be, if you're ready to go with an application, if you meet the requirements, uh, get it off as soon as you can. Um, is it possible the government may just stop processing applications that were already submitted, and halt the program, and return applications that haven't been processed to completion? That's entirely possible. Yes, it is. But um, it's also possible that the government might stop taking in new applications, but those that have already been submitted will be processed to completion. So uh, I think if you meet the requirements under AINP, your best bet is to submit an application as soon as possible, um, and keep your fingers crossed and hope for the best. So yeah, that would be my recommendation for AINP. Uh, and try to get your application submitted as quickly as possible, but try to do a complete application. Um, I haven't had the sense at all that AINP is being lax or easygoing about their expectations for applications. If you don't have a complete application submitted to AINP, there's a good chance they just won't process your application at all. So I'd recommend uh, applying as soon as possible. But let's say, for example, you need 12 months of Canadian or Alberta work experience and you only have 10 months. Don't submit your application now. If you only have 10 months of work experience, they're going to reject it for sure. Wait until you meet the the full requirement for the application, and then submit the application, but do it as soon as possible. Um, Wondering if there are any questions. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask at this point? No. Okay. Maybe just give it a couple of more minutes. Um, I'm always curious of where people are from, so and kind of what areas they're working in, that sort of thing, what their backgrounds are. So, um, yeah, maybe if you don't have an immigration question, want to tell me where you're from or what your favorite food that you could. I like to interact with people on the internet. I like to find out where my viewers are from and what interests them and what they're doing. Um, okay. Elia Lopez. She's from Mexico, living in Banff. Yeah. I've met a number of people over the years from Mexico and met a lot of Mexicans working in Banff actually too. Um, when I was growing up, Banff seemed to uh, be really geared towards Japanese tourists. Back in the 90s, the late 80s, early 90s, if you'd go to Banff, you'd have all the shop stores in Japanese as well as in English, and tons of Japanese tourists and um, but now you go to Banff, there are still some Japanese tourists, but I think those numbers have really gone down. And now you have people from all over the world and people going to Banff and working on working holidays. And yeah, you have people from Latin America working there. You have people from Asia. You have people from Australia, from Europe, from yeah, all sorts of different places. Um, but yeah, but Banff is a beautiful place. I'm looking forward to going back there at some point once the situation improves. I kind of I don't know if I'd even be allowed to go there right now. I heard that Banff was discouraging tourists, even tourists from Alberta, from visiting there at the time being. Um, but I'm not sure if that's still the case. But once Banff opens up again, I'm looking forward to going back because it's a beautiful place. It's always quite busy in Banff, and in some cases it seems busier even than downtown Calgary, especially on weekends and especially during the summer. Um, oh, and Ellie is telling me she already has a PR application in progress, but she's lost her job. Um, yeah, hopefully there are a lot of people like that who had everything going smoothly, but then the pandemic hit and now they've been laid off. Um, uh, all I can say is I hope you'll be hired back, Elia. I hope your employer will uh, get back on their feet and be able to hire you back. And I hope uh, that the loss of your job won't affect your PR application. Um, in some cases, uh, people may have their Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program nomination affected by the loss of employment. I think AINP isn't going to revoke nominations as long as it's just a temporary loss of employment, um, but if people remain unemployed throughout the processing of their PR, the federal part of their provincial nominee application, I think um, there is the risk that people could actually have their applications ultimately denied. So I hope that's not the case in your situation, Ellie. I hope you get your job back well before uh, IRCC is done processing your application, and I hope you have smooth sailing, and you get your PR without a hitch. Um, Elia mentioned she's working in hospitality, provincial nominee. If I find a new job, will that affect my PR application, new employer? Um, so not necessarily. If you find a new job, it depends what the restrictions are on your nomination certificate. So and it depends on what stream you applied under for permanent residence. So if you applied under the Alberta Opportunity Stream for under AINP, and then use that for your nomination to apply under the provincial nominee program federally. Um, so if you're under the Alberta Opportunity Stream, you you may not have to worry if you have a new employer, because the Alberta Opportunity Stream no longer requires arranged employment with a particular employer, um, but they do require a person to maintain valid lawful employment in the province of Alberta. So a new job with a new employer might be okay. Double check, look at your certificate, see if it has any restrictions on employment. But if certificate doesn't have restrictions on employment, then I think you're okay if you find a new employer. Um, uh, oh, and Elia indicated she's on a post-grad work permit. Okay, good. And it's possible that you might be able to qualify for a bridging work permit as well if your post-grad work permit is within 3 months of expiring. Veronica indicated, or she writes, "Hi Russ, I have a quick question. Can I apply for a work permit while holding a study permit and studying? Which one, study permit, work permit, will be valid if work permit approved?" Good question, Veronica. So a person can, in theory, hold multiple permits. You can, in theory, hold a study permit and a work permit. Sometimes a person will have more than one work permit at the same time. They might have a closed work permit and an open work permit at the same time, and those permits all remain valid. Now, that being said, um, I don't think it's likely that if you do have a study permit and you can be studying, that you'll qualify for a work permit. You now there are some situations, for example, under the immigration and refugee protection regulations, there are provisions that allow for students who are destitute to apply for a work permit. So that means a student who isn't able to support themselves ordinarily, but they can apply for a work permit. Most students don't need a work permit, though. In most cases, if you're currently studying, um, you're able to work uh, f- uh, up to 20 hours a week off campus, and you can actually work. There are no hourly limits to work on campus. So oftentimes international students will have on-campus jobs. They'll have security guard jobs on campus, or they'll be working in, the food court at their university or something like that. Or they'll be working as a teaching assistant or something like that. So you can, in many cases, and it depends on your study permit. Some study permits allow people to work, other study permits don't. Um, but in most cases, you can work up to 20 hours a week off campus, and you can also work on campus as well. Um, and then during semester breaks, you can work full time. And uh, and then after you're done your studies, when you graduate, you can apply for the postgraduate work permit in many cases. So yeah, it's theoretically possible you could apply for a work permit while you have a study permit. Um, but uh, you might not need that and lead to unintended problems down the road. So uh, if you apply for a work permit and you start working but you stop studying, then you might have a situation where you get your study permit revoked even. Um, so if a person on a study permit isn't maintaining full-time studies, uh, what happens is the institution is actually required to report that to the government. And so sometimes you have situations where people they apply for a study permit, but what they really want to do is work in Canada. So they get the study permit, they maybe go to their first day of classes, and then they skip everything and they go and do a job. Um, when the institution later on reports that the person dropped out of all their classes or flunked out of all their classes or whatever, and now they're not registered in any new classes in the second semester. Then the government, they might call you in for an interview, and they'll say, well, how come you're here in Canada on a study permit, but you're not studying? What are you doing? And if they find out that you're really working, and they determine that you didn't really have any intention to study, then uh, they might take steps to remove you from Canada. Um, so I've seen that with some people in the past. Uh, Now, sometimes there's a good reason for taking a break from studies. Maybe the institution where you're studying is no longer offering a program of like maybe that program got canceled due to the pandemic. Maybe the institution just had to close its doors. Maybe there are all sorts of reasons. Maybe there are some personal circumstances that mean you have to take a break from your studies. So sometimes people can justify uh, taking a bit of a break or a hiatus from their studies and doing something else. But um, I, I don't usually recommend kind of jumping from studying to working to going to studying. That's oftentimes difficult, and if you take a break from your studies and you get a work permit, and then you want to apply for a study permit later on, uh, you may get some skepticism from the officer who's looking at the application. They may wonder if your intention to study is in fact a legitimate one. Um, so back to your question, Veronica. Yes, in theory, you can have a work permit along with a study permit, but um, I wouldn't necessarily recommend going that route. Does anyone else have any questions? Doesn't look like it, and I'm at the 11:21 mark. So maybe I'll pack it in there for this week. Uh, I forgot to do this at the beginning of the webinar, but I'd really like to thank my student Sunny Liu, who's been helping me with this webinar series and who's been helping me at the office in general and allowing me to take some time to prepare for this series by covering off most of my immigration files. So if you're an existing immigration client of mine, chances are you've been working with Sunny, and she's been doing the lion's share of the so much Sunny. Yeah, I look forward to Sunny becoming called to the bar and becoming a full-fledged lawyer um, uh, in a not too distant future, probably within 6 months or so. Um, so thank you so much, Sunny. Thank you to all of you who tuned in to watch this webinar. I hope it's helpful to you. Um, uh, I plan on doing these webinars for the foreseeable future on Wednesday mornings at 10. So next week, if you aren't doing anything else, feel free to join me at the same time in the same place. And if you have any questions, by all means, send them my way. You can send them to me during the chat, and um, you can also email me, reach out to me in other ways. And if you have a burning question that you want to have discussed on the webinar, let me know, and I'll be happy to feature that information in the webinar, provided it deals with Canadian immigration law, and provided uh, it doesn't discuss personal situations. It only discusses kind of more abstract type situations. Because as I mentioned earlier, uh, this is public. This is YouTube. Anyone can search this. So I don't want to reveal very particular identifying details about viewers or clients or people like that. But by all means, send questions my way, and let me know if there's any information or content that you'd like me to present on my channel on this webinar series, and uh, I'd be happy to do that. But at any rate, I'll see you next week, and thanks for watching. Bye for now.